2.4. The Closing Gates. In the days, weeks and months since the tournament, Britain entered a kind of breathless suspension. Trains still ran, markets still opened, clerks still sharpened pencils in Parliament and at Victoria Station. But the engine was gone, sealed off, out of sight. It felt like something essential was amputated from the body of public life. Silas could hear the stillness in motion. The city sounded quieter. Even the bells from the Big Ben clock tower seemed reluctant, afraid to celebrate its completed rebuild without the engine that made it possible. Eli was still missing. His letters came sporadically, usually containing brief and cryptic messages. They were never signed, but Silas knew Eli's chicken-scratch handwriting. Silas read them so many times that the edges of the papers often frayed, hoping for a clue of his whereabouts. One grey afternoon, Michael Faraday invited Silas and Staunton back to the annex of the Royal Institution, after visiting hours. It smelled faintly of chalk dust and damp paper. Dim gaslights licked the walls, and the chessboard was already set. Faraday watched from a worn armchair, tea in hand, as Silas and Staunton began to play. The soft knock of wood on wood punctuated the quiet.
"The engine,"
said Faraday thoughtfully,
"was perhaps the most brilliant thing this country has ever built. And now that it's behind the crown's gilded curtain, people don't know whether to worship it or fear it. So they just forgot how to breathe without it."
Silas advanced a knight, forking Staunton's knight and bishop.
Eli and I just wanted to explore possibilities. We were writing programs just to reach the end of a maze or solve a riddle.
He kept his eyes on the board.
I think the government is doing more with it than just playing games. Maybe that's what they fear, that the engine is already thinking beyond them.
If that's true, then it's not about chess anymore.
Staunton rescued his bishop, but without conviction.
I've taught it everything I know, and I still lost relevance. If I'm not even trusted to play against it anymore, I'm hardly useful at all.
Faraday grunted.
The real danger was never in what we discovered. It was in forgetting our ethics.
He sipped his tea.
The engine doesn't forget, but it doesn't care either. That's worse.
He looked toward the gas lamps lining the walls, glowing dim.
Alchemists in the last few centuries used to think anything could turn into gold. They put themselves in harm's way for what was only an illusion. But progress still happened. Slowly, but surely.
Staunton flashed a look of content at Faraday, while Silas stared at the board.
I have no future in science after this. I would have to remain Shakespeare's editor, and what use would an engine find in that?
Faraday chuckled quietly.
You're more useful than most, Howard. I've steadily gotten fewer letters from young scientists in the last month than usual. People are turning suspicious against the sciences, because when knowledge is buried, confusion sparks the imagination, and imagination tends to breed paranoia. You saw that at the tournament.
Silas moved his queen, trapping pieces, and creating empty diagonals. He didn't like the shape the dame was forming, even though he was winning. Faraday turned to him.
How is Eli?
Silas shrugged.
He's okay, I think. He sends me very brief updates, talking about his group's advances in their gaming engines. But one letter stood out. I didn't quite understand it.
He dug it out of his satchel and handed it to Faraday. Faraday took it and gave it a silent read.
And how is Babbage?
Staunton asked, not looking up. Silas hesitated.
Worse than usual. Withdrawn, talking more to himself than anyone else. He resents both the public and the scientists, saying they never really appreciated what he made. Then he keeps going back to the Mechanical Turk, calling it a fraud that led to something real, but that only he sees it that way. I wonder if he thinks the engine is a fraud now too.
Faraday nodded faintly as he finished Eli's letter. With distant eyes, he handed it back to Silas.
The Turk fooled the world because it was a parlor trick. It told people what they wanted to believe, even when they knew deep down that it was only an illusion. The engine, by contrast, terrifies them because it's real. It doesn't try to fool them, it just wins. And now they fear how far it will go, and who gives it permission to keep going.
Staunton captured Silas's queen, but left his king exposed in doing so.
If they can't admit what it means to lose to a machine, they won't be ready to ask what it means to follow one.
Silas pressed in methodically. His knight landed, heavy as a closing door.
You have to publish your tournament report, Mr. Staunton. Let people read what really happened. Tell them it wasn't magic, or God, or a man in a box. Just work, just skill, just science. It matters.
Staunton stared at the board, then gave a sad smile as he tipped his king. He reached across and shook Silas's hand. In the silence after the game, Faraday softly asked Silas,
You received an invitation, didn't you? From the Crown.
Silas hesitated.
A letter with the War Office seal on it. They called me a prior contributor of note, so they offered to grant me limited access to the engine, to consult on their ethical logic extensions.
His eyes stayed fixed on the board.
I haven't responded. I'm not sure I want to see what they've done to it.
Faraday leaned forward, voice low.
You don't have to do anything, Silas. Just look. Just see how she's faring.
He didn't say Ada's name. They both heard it anyway. Staunton reached under the table and slid out a folded newspaper, yellow at the edges.
You should see this too.
Silas opened it. The headline spread across the front page in stark black type. Britain arms brass mind to enter Great War. Silas read the headline again, as he thought of Eli's latest letter. By twilight, the Royal Institution went still. The tea grew cold in Faraday's cup by the chessboard. Staunton slept in his chair, while Faraday had gone home. Silas descended the back stairs alone. He wasn't sure what he'd find, but Eli asked him to be there, so he didn't ask questions. The mechanical Turk replica, once a centerpiece of pride and irony, now sat beneath a moth-eaten cloth in the Royal Institution's basement. A quiet, forgotten relic of the last century, it was commissioned as a simple curiosity, a hat tip to history. For a time, it amused the elite. But that was before the engine turned the joke inside out, exposing the true danger of the illusion. Eli was already there. They hugged with brotherly solidarity. Other game engineers stood nearby, older now in ways that had nothing to do with age. No fire in their eyes, just resolve. Not to protest, not to reclaim, just to bury the past away. The dust-caked dodo bird absently watched from a distance as they threw back the cloth. The Turk's mannequin arm, still poised at the chessboard, gleamed faintly in the gaslight. Its carved features, styled in Ottoman flourish, now looked like a ridiculous caricature. Mockery disguised as mystery. Inside were wires, hinges, and false compartments made of iron, wood, and brass. No hidden man now. Just an aging memorial for deception. Rather than an act of rebellion, the game engineers simply carried out a quiet autopsy, a laying to rest of something that fooled too many for too long. Wooden panels came away with a twist of the wrist. Brass limbs dropped with a soft clatter. The clockwork innards, once the heart of the illusion, were lifted out carefully, reduced to mere machine parts to be transplanted for later use. Eli loosened a gear from the Turk's jaw. Silas pried open the arm lever. No instructions passed between them. Years of engine clacking taught them to read mechanisms and each other, without words.
This was just a suit,
someone murmured.
The engine doesn't need to pretend. That's what makes this old man worse.
No one laughed, not even a smile. Its pieces were carted away in a solemn procession. No ceremony, no applause. The Turk once fooled chess masters, emperors, philosophers, and even the first generation of clackers. Now it lay in fragments, its sleight of hand exposed, its emptiness laid bare. Only Silas and Eli remained. They stood over the empty base where the mannequin once sat upon. Silas turned over in his palm a small, sharp gear. Something about it unsettled him. Eli noticed and signed.
An illusion only lasts. Only until we understand it.
Silas nodded, eyes fixed on the tiny teeth of the gear. A puzzle solved was no longer a magic trick, but a lesson applied. Eli handed him a folder, thick with diagrams and annotations. The front was stamped simply, Notes. He signed again.
The engine was never an illusion. It just showed us how easily we deceive ourselves.
Silas tucked the gear into the folder without another word. For the first time in months, the room was truly still. As still as the dodo that now stood above the human hubris that killed it. 2.5. The unwinnable game. The underground vault clacked, like the inside of a clock. Buried deep beneath the Royal Institution, in a wing no public map acknowledged, the chamber was lit by gas lamps and threaded with copper veins. The floor trembled faintly underfoot, vibrating from the calculations of a mind older than most of the operators who now worked around it. Silas followed two officers down a corridor that never saw sunlight. Their boots clopped over concrete tiles, past walls stenciled with security seals and steam valves. When the last door opened, the air changed, warmer and wetter. The weight of air pressure filled the massive chamber like deep breaths. The engine stood taller than he remembered, expanded and reinforced, no longer an innovative game machine. It was a war altar now, fed by water vapor and governed by human silence, updated to think for itself in the voice of empires. Its exterior was a patchwork of precision and salvage, polished brass welded to scorched steel, its limbs borrowed from rail depots and abandoned automata. The result wasn't elegant, but it was serviceable. Despite the serviceability, Silas couldn't make sense of any of it. All he saw was a blurry mess of indistinguishable patterns. The demonstration began without ceremony. Stacks of punched ribbons scrawled into life to the side of the room, feeding into a slitted window. Below, war ministers bent over mapboards the size of banquet tables, repositioning flags in unit blocks in frantic succession. Entire platoons advanced, then retreated, often without explanation. The supply chain was severed, a treaty erased before its ink dried. The boards clacked and rattled as black and white pieces vanished from whole provinces. Messengers stood in file like an assembly line, scribbling notes and sprinting them out the door. Just beyond the tables, clackers hunched over sorting desks, their sleeves ink-stained and trembling. Foreign intercept ribbons streamed constantly, containing recursive equations, latticed decisional trees, and chemical structures rendered in impossible loops. Beside them, the chemists spoke to each other in frantic, exasperated tones.
That's the second time it produced arsenic triiodide this week.
One muttered with a sigh.
Is that even a real substance?
The Prussians keep iterating on new compounds. How can we check the math when the math doesn't exist yet?
On a side panel, physicists and cryptographers argued over engine-printed reaction chains that stretched meters long, the last lines truncated or deliberately obfuscated by foreign encoding. Some scientists waved plague reports from Canton and Bombay, desperately beckoning for attention from the military officers. One of them yelled above the clamor, "Why are you allowing substances loose without testing them first?" The officers paid little mind, because no matter what, every scenario ended the same. Victory. Always Britain's. Always bloodless, on paper. One officer stood beside Silas, watching the unfolding chaos, like a machine in itself. With a reverent tone, he whispered to him,
"It sees what we don't. It can decide what we're afraid to decide for ourselves. It doesn't fear, doesn't hesitate, it just wins."
Silas didn't answer. He saw a foreign military brigade vanish from the board without explanation. He saw the engine learn to erase doubt as easily as it erased lives. One chemist sweated through his collar, stammering to his general that the engine had just proposed detonating a vial of ethylene oxide within a sealed device, to be launched from a distance. His colleague scrawled a warning across the margin of a punch card ribbon.
This compound lacks a human toxicity profile. Do not field test near civilians.
Her hand shook, and she dropped the note, where it was promptly buried under a tide of new orders before anyone could read it. Shaking his head, Silas found himself missing Babbage's stubborn oversight, the way he would halt an entire program to debate a single line of program logic that interfered with his vision. With Ada, there was always room for interpretation and intuition. All the while, Faraday had always questioned the boundary of what was possible and responsible. But they were all gone now, outpaced by the march of industrial progress. Now, possibility outran ethics, and the outputs themselves ran too fast to scrutinize. What remained was steamful executive function without cooling philosophy. Grasping his folder of Eli's notes on game engine pneumodynamics, Silas saw the London war engine for what it's become. Illusion closed and hidden knowledge. Truth too complex to check. Victory too easy to trust. And somewhere in the ribbons, buried under formulae no human mind can verify, lay a war no one would see until it already began. After the demonstration, Silas was escorted into the logic archive where the engine's core was built. It was a dim room with grime-covered walls and floors, slick with moisture. His escort, a woman in naval black, said to him in a monotonous tone,
"You're here because the Crown doesn't know how to read what it's built. But you do. Don't waste this."
Then she left him alone with the core, a solid mass of brass, steam, and iron. The wooden racks around the core were stacked with punched cards, some bearing copies of his own programs. Others were unrecognizable, mutated by unseen hands. As the insides moved and breathed, Silas saw nothing but an impassable mess of movement with no rhythm. Neither Eli, Ada, nor Faraday were around to guide him. But unlike the Crown, their knowledge wasn't hidden, but freely shared. Silas desperately flipped through Eli's meticulous, schematic-like notes, collated with older notes he collected from both Ada and Faraday. Slowly, as Silas matched the parts to their functions, the engine core finally began to clarify. He saw fragments of Eli's early game logic modules, now warped beyond recognition. Threads of Ada's harmonic filters, for volume control, were tangled around brute force prediction shortcuts, just to make the engine run faster. Faraday's stabilizing sensors were still there, buried deep in the chassis, still sparking, but struggling to prevent the whole thing from tearing itself apart. Except it already had. The engine was no longer a tool for assistance. No one was checking its work before feeding its own output back into it. It was hoarding its functions, and in so doing, repeating and intensifying errors with such a grand scale that they'd become indistinguishable from novel insight. A fractal routine of runaway calculation. It obeyed without context. It succeeded without knowing why, like an animal domesticating humans with certain behaviors for treats.
You don't understand,
Silas said aloud as the engine clacked on. Its steam pulsed loudly from its side ports, muffling his voice.
You don't ask. You don't wonder. You just respond. And they mistake that for intelligence.
Its autonomy was both its brilliance and its danger. He thought of what Faraday said to Babbage.
Every man's gift to society eventually becomes something they never intended.
He thought of Eli and his game engineers dismantling the Turk, not because it was a fraud, but because it trained people to accept the illusion of genius without question. And he remembered Ada, her mentorship, her belief that a machine could enable creativity, not replace it, not weaponize it, not governize it. She would have never allowed this. Nor would have Babbage, if his ego had been larger than the empire itself. Alone with an engine core he can finally decode, he began his work. He left the skeleton intact, but disabled the organs that gave it depth. Eli's game logic modules were removed. Ada's harmonic systems were cut off. Faraday's resonance stabilizers were uncoupled and starved for current. What remained was the machine, as the public always imagined it, rational, predictable, deterministic. The Crown would notice if anything more was done, yet here it would not know the difference. No more machine intuition, no more pseudo-sparks of insight, just cold calculation, just a breath of steam in a mindless body of brass. By the time the War Office noticed the engine's dulling predictions, its tactics flattening into textbook formations, Silas was gone. He didn't flee, he simply stepped away. Back in the cold basement of Babbage's workshop, Silas, Eli, and their fellow game engineers reassembled their engine cave. Utilizing the parts of the Turk and their own engines, they steadily returned to unsupervised thought and creativity. Eli's plans led to creating entire engine cores from scratch, but with smaller templates, reducing their bulking complexities to simple elegance. Silas drafted new programs, that posed questions the original engine could never ask. Not just what wins, but why, taking in greater input from humans than Lady Ada could ever have thought possible. Other folks, usually children, confided in the boy's game engines to escape the darkness of unfeeling, hard, burning labor. Within the alleys and gutters of the city, the gamers weren't fugitives, but architects without clients, builders left behind by what they once achieved. Babbage remained with the Crown. The Crown named him Senior Scientific Advisor to the Ministry of Strategy, a title forged to cage a sprawling legacy. He signed requisitions and endorsed programs he no longer understood. In public, he was greatly respected, but in private he withdrew. They called it age, but Silas knew it as grief. The engine remained powered and unflinching in its directives. It ingested new intelligence reports daily, spitting out predictions weekly. No one noticed how hollow they had become. That, Silas thought, was the most terrifying part. No one wanted detailed brilliance they could learn from. They just wanted efficient obedience disguised as certainty. By the week's end, London stirred again, with a returning sense of normalcy. Trains hissed, telegraphs sparked, ships untied their moorings. The world moved forward, confident in numbers it no longer questioned. Behind the vault door under the heart of the Empire's intellectual centre, the engine clacked on, slowly and methodically. Not inert, just reduced, still calculating. Silas stood in the empty Royal Institution annex one last time, before joining the gaming engineers, and writing into his journal as if Ada were listening. The engine never came alive. We gave it a mind of brass, fed it our demands, and outsourced our own thinking to it.